Hello, welcome to the third seminar in syntax, the presentation, and this week will be part 2 of introducing X-bar theory. Last week I said that X-bar theory comes in two parts, the X part, which is what we dealt with last week, and the bar part, and it's the bar part that we're going to be looking at today. Moreover, we'll introduce a new element called the specifier. So it's time to look at the second rule of X-bar syntax. It may look a bit familiar to you because it looks pretty much like the first rule, which was like this. Both of them are phrase structure rules. They've got an arrow in the middle and a symbol to the left and some symbols to the right of the arrow. The one on the left is what gets drawn at the top of the tree, and the ones underneath get drawn underneath with branches coming from them. So these two rules produce fairly similar looking structures, but there are some differences, as you can see if you look a bit more closely. The first rule that we looked at last week had a phrase accompanying the head which followed it, and we called that the complement. This new rule that we're looking at here has a phrase for the YP, only that comes in front of the whole phrase rather than at the end of it. We call this new phrase a specifier, and we'll see that the specifiers actually have different properties to complements. The other difference we can see in this new rule is that the X to the right of the arrow has this little mark there, and that mark is the bar. So what this says is that an X phrase contains a YP, which is the specifier, and an X bar. Now, what does that mean? Well, in order to see what this is all about, I'm going to first of all have to admit to a little white lie that I told last week, and that is that I said that the first rule has the XP being made up of the head followed by the complement. Actually, that XP of the first rule isn't an XP at all, it's an X bar. And of course, before introducing the bar notion, I couldn't really tell you the truth of this. Actually then, the rule, the proper version of the first rule looks like this. It says that an X bar is made up of the head followed by the complement. So these two rules work in conjunction to produce a more complex phrase. The first, the new rule tells you that the XP contains the X bar, and then last week's rule tells us that the X bar contains the X, the head. So they work together to produce a structure that looks like that. Now, what this says is that phrases have three levels. Every phrase has these three levels. Remember, this is a very general theory. It makes use of these category variables like X and Y, and they range over all categories. So what the claim is that all phrases have exactly this structure. They have these three levels. At the bottom we have the 0 level, and that concerns the head. Above that we have the bar level with the X bar. The X bar contains the head and its complement. And above that we have what is sometimes referred to as the double bar level. The reason why it's called a double bar level is that one way of representing this phrase to make clear the fact that the phrase is something seen as growing up from the head up to the top, is that the phrase is often represented as an X with 2 bars on it, or as is pronounced, the X double bar. X double bar and XP are entirely equivalent notions. Basically, they're the things that you get at the top. So the idea is that we go from an X with no bars on it, with 0 bars, that's why it's called the 0 level, up to an X with 1 bar on it, the bar level, up to one more higher level with 2 bars on it, the double bar level. Okay, and that's it. You don't go any higher than that, and that's why X double bar and XP mean the same thing. That's the topmost node on the phrase. Okay, so now we've introduced this new aspect of XBAR theory. Let's put it into practice and look at how we analyze specific phrases using it. Last week we argued that the inflection was the head of the clause, so clauses are IPs. And we said that clauses come with these three parts to them. An initial phrase, in this case it's the subject, followed by the inflection itself, and then the verb phrase at the end. Now I want to start by considering the relationship between the inflection and the verb phrase. So we'll concentrate on the VP and the inflectional element. Now, turns out that whatever you can get following an inflection is extremely limited. Essentially, you can get a VP in that position. So the men will go home. Go home is a VP. It can follow an inflection. But you can't get a DP in that position. You can't say the men will the house, or a preposition phrase, the men will to the house, or an adjectival phrase, the men will very easy. In fact, you can't get any other phrase than a VP in that position. So it looks as though the position following the inflection is a very restricted set of possibilities. Just VPs will go there. And one thing we know is that heads impose restrictions on their complements. So does this mean that the VP is the complement of the inflection? Well, let's have a look at some of the properties. First of all, the VP is a phrase, and complements are phrases. Secondly, the VP follows the inflection, and you can't get a VP in front of the inflection. You can't say John leave will. It has to be John will leave. And again, complements in English follow the head. And as we've just seen, the VP is restricted. It's a very limited set of possibilities that can appear there, and therefore that would suggest again that this is another property that this has in common with complements. So all of the evidence looks then like pointing to the conclusion that the VP acts as the complement of the inflection. However, we've seen last week when we were looking at complements and heads that with verbs you get a whole range of different types of complements depending on which verb you're using. Some verbs are intransitive, i.e. they don't have complements at all. Some verbs are transitive. They have a DP complement or an object. Some verbs are prepositional. They have PP complements. Some verbs have AP complements, and some verbs even have sentences as complements. It all depends on the particular verb. And we said that as a lexical property, heads select for which complements they take. Now, it's slightly different what's going on with the inflection, because it turns out that all inflections must be followed by VPs, and you don't get any variation here. Different inflections will all select the same complement. So the men will go home, the men can go home, may go home, or if it's a present tense, the men go home, or the past tense, the men went home. Okay, it's always going to be a VP. So there does look to be a difference there between what's going on between the inflection and the phrase that follows it, and the verb and the phrase that follows it. However, I think this difference can be understood in terms of the properties of these particular types of heads, and that the general restrictive nature of the elements which follow them is the same. It's just that these different kinds of heads have different properties which lead us to these observable differences. Verbs fall into a major subcategory of categories, or not subcategory, but supercategory of categories, which concern words which carry the main semantic meaning of the sentences that they're contained in. Verbs are very descriptive words. They carry the descriptive content of the sentence. These sorts of words talk about the who does what to who aspect of the sentence meaning. Now, that particular kind of meaning is often referred to as the thematic structure of a sentence. And so the categories like nouns and verbs and adjectives, which carry these types of meanings, are often referred to as thematic categories. So there is a large division in the kinds of categories, and nouns, verbs, and adjectives all fall into this one thematic category. Inflections, on the other hand, belong to a different set of elements called functional categories. Functional categories don't carry the primary meaning of the sentence. Their meanings tend to be secondary, and they're often associated with a particular aspect of the meaning of the sentence. Tense, for example, and modals talk about either the time reference that something that happens is placed in, or whether that's something that happens is possible or necessary. Those sorts of ideas. That's what inflections talk about. And note the things that happen, that's what the verb phrase talks about. So in a sense, you can see then that inflections semantically are connected to the meaning of the verb phrase. Determiners are also another kind of functional category. Determiners talk about the definiteness or indefiniteness, or the quantity of something. And some things that they're talking about, the definiteness or indefiniteness or quantity of, is exactly what the noun expresses. So determiners are associated with nouns. It's therefore not surprising, given that thematic categories tend to be rather semantically complex because they carry this contentful meaning of sentences, that they need to have various kinds of complements in order to be able to express the meanings that they have. Whereas functional categories tend to be semantically much more simple and are particularly restricted to being associated with a particular kind of thing. Therefore, they only have one type of complement. So I think we can maintain then that the verb phrase is the complement of the inflection, even though the complements of functional categories do tend to be a lot more restricted than those of thematic categories. Okay, so it seems fairly straightforward then that we accept that the verb phrase is the complement of the inflection. But what about the other phrase that appears inside the clause, the subject? What is that? Is that also a complement of the inflection? Well, it's a phrase, so that's one thing in its favour, but it precedes the inflection, and complements always follow the heads in English, at least. So that would be one reason not to think of the subject as a complement. Furthermore, the subject isn't always a DP. You can get a whole range of different types of subjects. For example, you could have a preposition phrase in the subject position. Out here could be nice. You can have an adjectival phrase in that position. Too loud would be awful. You can even have a sentence like he laughed in the subject position. That he laughed was awkward. Okay, and note what what category of subject you have here is not dependent on which particular inflection you have. All of these subjects will go with all types of inflections. So there's no connection here between the kinds of the categories that you have in the subject position and the particular inflection that you have. Therefore, there's no limit, no restriction placed on the category of the subject like there is on the category of the complement. So again, then, this is another reason to believe that the subject is not a complement of the inflection. It doesn't have that restrictive relationship with the head of the phrase that a complement would have. Furthermore, there is a relationship that does exist between the subject and the inflection, which is itself not typical of a complement. The subject agrees with the inflection. What this means is that the form of the inflection is connected to certain properties of the subject, and you can see that most clearly in English when we use the verb to be. If we have a third person singular subject, then the form of the verb is. He is swimming. If it's a singular first person subject, then the form is am. I am swimming. And if it's anything else, say plural or second person, then the form is are. Now, this relationship is known as agreement. Okay, and what's going on here is that the form of the inflection is being determined by properties of the subject, or there is a connection between the two, and that is called agreement. Okay, so we have agreement between the subject and the inflection. That's not something that tends to hold between heads and complements. Heads and complements don't agree with each other like the subject and the inflection do. So that would suggest again that this is something else, something different. Okay, there's another observation that we can make with the aid of looking at a particular phenomenon known as coordination. This example gives us an instance of coordination. A man and a woman were present. What we have here is a subject, which is a DP, a man and a woman. And yet this is a bit of a strange DP because it seems as though it contains two noun phrases, man and woman. Now, we saw last week that a DP has a complement, a single complement, which is a noun phrase. So how is it that we're able to fit two noun phrases into this one complement position? Well, the mechanism that allows us to do this is known as coordination, and it involves this kind of element known as a conjunction. Basically, what this mechanism does is that it's something that allows us to take two things and put them together so that they behave as though they're one thing. So what we've actually got here is there is just one noun phrase position after that determiner, but that element, that noun phrase, is made up of two noun phrases put either side of a conjunction, and that makes them into one element. Now, the process of coordination is slightly limited. You can't just coordinate any two phrases. For example, you couldn't coordinate a DP with an AP. You couldn't say a man and quickly, or a VP with a PP, like Mary and in the park, or a DP and a PP, a man and in the park. None of those things work. Basically, the only things that can be coordinated are two phrases which are of the same type. So you can coordinate two noun phrases, two determiner phrases, two verb phrases, two preposition phrases, two adjectival phrases, two phrases as long as they are the same sort. And I think that's fairly understandable given the nature of what coordination is all about. As I said, it's taking two elements and making one element out of them. If you take two elements which are different, what's the nature of the thing that you create going to be? So what would you get if you coordinated a DP with a VP? I mean, it wouldn't be a VP and it wouldn't be a DP. What would it be? only if you coordinate two phrases of the same type are you going to end up with a consistent thing that is created by the coordination. Two DPs will make a DP, two VPs will make a VP, etc., etc. So I think this restriction is fairly understandable. But now consider this sentence. Okay, he rang up his assistant and up the bank manager. Okay, now there's something wrong with that, but what is wrong with it? If you look at it, it looks as though we're coordinating two phrases of the same kind. We've got up his assistant in front of the and up the bank manager after the and. So it looks, at least at the surface, that we're coordinating two preposition phrases. And they are two phrases which are the same, so there should be nothing wrong with this. Well, actually, if you look at it a bit more carefully, you can see that this isn't quite what's going on here. We've not really got two preposition phrases because what we've got here is a special kind of a verb. This verb is made up of two parts. It's called a phrasal verb. It's got the verb ring, and the preposition that follows it is a particle which forms a single complex verb out of these two things. So really the structure looks like this. Ring up forms a verb, a phrasal verb, and then what we have after that is an object, the complement of that complex verb to form the VP. Now once you see this structure, you can see that the preposition plus the object don't form a preposition phrase. In fact, those two things don't form any kind of phrase at all. There's no single node which is directly above them, connected to to each of them by a branch, which contains nothing else. Okay, so the preposition followed by the DP is not a phrase in itself. And what then leads us to explain the ungrammaticality of the sentence is that basically you can only coordinate two things which are phrases. They have to be the same category of phrase, but they have to be a phrase. Something which does not form a phrase cannot be coordinated with something else that doesn't form a phrase, even if they look the same, even if they are the same string of words. If they're not a phrase, you can't coordinate them. Now, we can use that observation just like we used observations last week about the distribution and the replacement possibilities to produce tests for the structure of a sentence. There was the distribution test and the replacement test. Well, we can also make use of the coordination test to see what is and isn't a phrase within a structure. Basically, it runs like this. If two strings of words can be coordinated, they constitute a phrase. Okay, so if you can coordinate two things, you know they are phrases. If you can't coordinate them, then chances are they're not phrases. Now, with that in mind, consider this sentence. John could meet Mary, but will stay at home instead. Okay, what's being coordinated here? We've got this conjunction but, which works similarly to and. There's a slight difference in meaning, but syntactically it works the same. Two phrases can be coordinated by but, so what is actually being coordinated here? Well, looking at the sentence, what we seem to have is in front of the but, we've got an inflection and a verb phrase, and behind it we've got an inflection and a verb phrase. Given that you can only coordinate phrases, that would seem to suggest that the inflection and the verb phrase go together to form a phrase. Okay, the fact that this is a grammatical coordination shows us that inflections and VPs form some sort of phrase. But this is the structure that we proposed for clauses. And as you can see fairly clearly in this, the inflection and the verb phrase together don't constitute a phrase at all. They're part of the whole IP, but they're not the IP. There isn't a single node that is directly above them which doesn't connect with something else. So what that leads us to the conclusion is that this analysis can't be right, because the inflection plus the verb phrase must form some constituent. In fact, what we seem to have is a structure that looks like this. Here we've got the inflection and the verb phrase going together to form something, and then that something with the subject going together to form the entire IP. Of course, the question is, what is that something that is formed by the inflection and the verb phrase? Well, X-bar theory says every phrase must have a head. So whatever this is, it must have a head. And the only head that's available for it is the inflection, because that's the only word. The other thing is a phrase, and phrases can't be heads. So it looks as though this thing is going to have to be an inflection phrase, because the head seems to be the inflection. But now, this analysis can't possibly be correct, because it makes some predictions about the subject. What we have here is two IPs. One of them's got a subject in it and the other one hasn't got a subject. So therefore, it's claiming that IPs don't have to have subjects. But IPs do have to have subjects. You can't just say, could meet Mary, and that would be a sentence. Okay, you've got to have the subject. John could meet Mary in order to make the full sentence. So the inflection plus the verb phrase by itself can't form an IP. Furthermore, what we've got here is an IP inside an IP. And we've seen that this is a recursive structure. Now, if that's true, then if an IP could also have a subject, then the second IP could also have a subject, and we would end up with a structure that looked like this. So an IP with a subject contains an IP with a subject, which contains an IP, in this case doesn't have a subject, but you can see you could keep on going and having multiple subjects. So the actual prediction is not only can IPs not have subjects at all, but they can have an infinite amount of subjects. But that's not true. Clauses have to have one subject, but they can only have one subject. They can't have any more than one subject. You can't say John Mary could meet Bill. Okay, you could say John and Mary meet Bill. You could coordinate two things, but that in itself shows that there is just one subject position, because you have to coordinate two things in order to make them one. So clauses only have one subject, and they must have at least one subject. Therefore, the inflection plus the verb phrase can't be an IP. It's at this point that we see the advantages of the X-bar analysis. If we claim that what constituent the inflection plus the verb phrase makes is an I-bar, not an IP, we're claiming that that thing isn't a complete sentence. We're saying it's bigger than the inflection. Obviously, it's not a word, it's something bigger than the word, because it includes both the inflection and the VP. But it's not as big as the full sentence because it lacks a subject. Okay, so everything here now becomes consistent. I-bar and IP are not the same thing. We won't expect them to have the same distributions. IPs contain subjects, I-bars don't. But I-bars are not just inflections. They are more than the inflection. They are an intermediate level of the structure. So if we accept this as our analysis of the clause, the conclusion we come to about the subject is that the subject is the specifier of the IP, not a complement. Okay, and we can see that it's in a completely different structural position to the complement, and therefore we expect it to have different properties. Essentially, the properties of specifiers are that they precede, and that they enter into agreement relationships with the head. They are not restricted by the head like complements are. Okay, now X-bar theory, as we know, is a general theory. Therefore, we would predict that if IPs have specifiers, then, well, every kind of phrase has a specifier. So we need to start to look for specifiers in other phrases. We'll start, in fact, in this presentation, we'll only look at one more phrase, and that's the determiner phrase. So let's look at the the possibility of a specifier in the DP. Okay, the question is, do we find specifiers in DPs? Well, according to the theory, we know a few things about specifiers now. First of all, we know that they're phrases. Second, we know that they come first. They're always the first element inside the phrase. So in order to find the specifier of a DP, what we're looking for is an initial phrase inside the DP. Now, one possible candidate of such a specifier is the possessor. Okay, the possessor forms a phrase that comes at the beginning of the DP. So the man's hat has a possessor, the man's, and the man's is obviously a DP, and it comes at the front of the whole DP, the man's hat. So that would seem to be a good candidate as something that might be analysed as the specifier of the DP. And if so, we would put it like this. Okay, the man's, the possessor, sitting in the specifier position. Hat is an NP sitting in the complement position. But then we've got the determiner there. Now the determiner, being the head, sits between the specifier and the complement, and it's vacant, so we would predict that you should be able to put a determiner into that position. But when you do that, you end up with something that's ungrammatical. You can't say the man's the hat. So it looks then as though our analysis is making the wrong prediction. It looks as though possessors and determiners are in complementary distribution. Okay, where you have one, you can't have the other, and vice versa, which would therefore suggest that this analysis isn't correct. However, before we throw it away completely, it's worth making the observation that such structures do exist, though not in English. For example, consider this structure of a Hungarian. Here you have a possessor, az embernek, followed by a determiner, or followed by the noun phrase kalapja. Okay, so az embernek a kalapja means literally the man's the hat. Okay, this is exactly the structure that we've predicted should exist, and it does exist in Hungarian, unfortunately just not in English. So actually then, the question to ask is, well, what's going on in English? Why does English not allow this construction? And to see that, it's worth having a look at the nature of this element that we get in English, possessors, the marker of the possessor, this apostrophe S. And let's have a consider of how that behaves. Here are some examples. The Queen's crown. Okay, this apostrophe S is the marker of the possessor. It marks who is the possessor, and here it seems to be fairly straightforward. The Queen is the person that possesses the crown, and the S is on the word Queen's. Okay. However, consider the next one, the Queen of England's crown. Now here, England is not the possessor of the crown. It's still the Queen that owns the crown, not England. And yet the possessive marker is on England. So that seems to be something strange going on there. You would think that the possessive marker should go on the thing that is the possessor, i.e. the Queen. And so this should be the Queen's of England crown. But that's not how it works. The third example is even worse. The Queen who died's crown. Here the possessive marker is on the verb, and verbs couldn't possibly be possessors. They don't express the same kind of meanings that a possessor could be. So what is actually going on here? Why is this possessive marker ending up on all sorts of different places? Well, I think if you look at it, take a step back and look at it, it's fairly obvious that what is going on here is that possessive marker isn't actually attaching itself to any particular word. What it's doing is it's sticking itself onto the end of the whole phrase. So in the first case, it's stuck onto the phrase the Queen. In the second, it's stuck onto the phrase the Queen of England. And in the third one, it's stuck onto the phrase the Queen who died. Okay, so what we've actually got then is that this element here is a very special kind of morpheme. Morphemes typically stick themselves onto stems or parts of words or words themselves. This thing seems to stick itself onto phrases. Okay, so if that's the right analysis of this, if we now look at that element and consider its position, well, it comes after the possessor and it comes before the NP complement. In other words, it's sitting in exactly the same position where you would expect a determiner to be. And if it's in that determiner position, we therefore have a very straightforward explanation as to why you can't have a determiner in a possessive construction in English, why you can't say the man's the hat. Because actually that apostrophe S is actually sitting in the determiner position. We also know that it's the position that something occupies that determines its category. And therefore, if we assume that this element here is sitting in the determiner position, the analysis is it is a determiner. And it's in complementary distribution with other determiners. So the actual analysis we end up with is, as we can see here on the left-hand side now, the man is sitting in the possessor position, sorry, the specifier position. The head of this phrase is the possessive determiner, s, and it has a complement NP. Okay, so this looks as though then, given this analysis, we can conclude that DPs do indeed have specifiers and the specifier is the possessor. Now, the last thing I want to do then, having now identified two specifiers, that of subjects and possessors, I want to compare these two to see what properties they share in common. Are we right to analyze them both as specifiers? Well, first of all, they are specifiers in as much as they both come first in their respective phrases. Subjects are phrases which introduce IPs. You can't get the subject at the end of the IP, so you can't say, will leave the man. It has to be the man will leave. Exactly the same is true of possessors. They introduce DPs and can't come at the end of them. You can't say, bike the man. It's got to be the man's bike. You can only ever get one specifier, and you can only have one subject. You can't say the man, the woman will leave. And you can only have one possessor. You can't say the man's, the woman's bike. Okay, so both of them seem to behave similarly in that respect. We saw the inflection agrees with the subject. In as much as the form of the inflection is dependent on the properties of the subject. If the subject is third person and singular, then you have to have a third person and singular form of the inflection. Okay, so you can't say the man ride the bike, it's got to be the man rides the bike with the S form of the inflection for third person singular. Well, exactly the same thing is true of the determiner, the possessive determiner. Whenever you have a possessive determiner, you've got to have a possessor. When you haven't got a possessor, you can't get the possessive determiner. So you've got to have the man's bike. You can't say the man the bike without a possessive determiner. Similarly, you can't say spike without there being a determiner, without there being a possessor. Okay, so we can see there is an agreement relationship between the determiner and the possessor, such as whenever you've got a possessor, you must have a form of the determiner which is the possessive determiner. So again, we see a similarity here between subjects and possessors, that they do seem to behave as a specifier does. There are, however, some differences. The subject is an obligatory element of the sentence. You can't miss subject out. You can't say, we'll ride the bike. Okay, you've got to have the man will ride the bike. Possessors, on the other hand, are optional elements of the DP. You can have a possessor, but you don't have to have a possessor. So while you can say the man's bike, you can also say the bike without a possessor at all. Now, this turns out to be a difference between clauses and any other type of phrase. It's only clauses that have to have specifiers. And that's something special about IPs, rather than there being some sort of difference here between subjects and possessors being marked by this. Another area or another observation in which we can claim that there are some differences but at the same time some similarities is this idea that the possessor is a special kind of morpheme which sticks itself onto its specifier, basically, the phrase which comes before it. We could call this element a clitic. A clitic is simply something which attaches itself to whatever it is that precedes it. So we can say that the possessive determiner is a clitic. Well, we can find clitic inflections too. Some inflections will stick themselves onto the subject. For example, the inflection will, the modal auxiliary will, can contract to the form ul, and when it does, it sticks itself onto the subject. So you get the man'll ride the bike. Okay. Other inflections that do that are could. They reduce to "d", and then you get the man'd ride the bike. Okay, so you can find clitic inflections just like you've got a clitic determiner, and again we see the similarity there. The difference is it's only some inflections that do this, and all of those also have a non-clitic form, so will versus ul and could versus "d". Okay, whereas with the determiner there is only the clitic form, there is no non-clitic form of the possessive determiner. All in all then, I think it looks as though possessors and subjects share sufficiently amount of properties to conclude that they really are a very similar element within the phrases that they occupy. So we can conclude then that subjects are rightly analysed as specifiers of IPs and possessors as specifiers of DPs. So let's briefly summarize what we've said so far. All phrases have three levels. They have the 0 level, which consists of the head. They have the bar level, the X bar, which contains the head and its complement. And then they have the double bar level, which contains the specifier and the X bar. The double bar level is equivalent to XP, and you'll see we can change between those two things. You'll often use XP to represent that double bar level, but you can use X with 2 bars on it. All phrases conform to that pattern, okay, because X bar theory is a general theory, and therefore what is true of one thing will be true of everything. The complement is the phrase that follows the head inside X bar, and the specifier is the phrase preceding the X bar inside the XP. Now, I should make it clear here that these statements are partly language specific. Whether or not the complement precedes or follows the head is dependent on which language you're looking at. English is a language where the complement follows the head. We call that a head initial language. The head comes first, followed by the complement. Other languages are head final. That is, the complement comes first and the head is at the end. Japanese is a language like that. The same is true for the specifier. In English, the specifier precedes the X bar, but not in every language you can get specifiers that follow X bars. But what is true of all languages is that X bar contains a head and a complement, and XP contains the specifier and an X bar. The specific ordering of those elements within those constituents is language specific. Okay. Finally, subjects are specifiers of IPs and possessors are specifiers of DPs. Okay, that concludes today's presentation. I'll see you in class. Bye.